So this is kind of an abrupt change. We're going from the character and the individual Daniel straight into what has traditionally been a very difficult vision or prophecy that Daniel had. Looks like this one's the better one. So I think what we'll do is we've been given 15 minutes of talk time and then 15 minutes of question time. So I'm going to break it into transition through three different perspectives. One, we'll pick up a little bit off of Brother Isaiah's character. We'll deal with that for the first few minutes, the character of Daniel, who he was, and the environment that he was in. Then we'll go into what his role was when we get into chapter 7 here with regard to the natural people and the Jews that were captive in Babylon during this time. And then we'll go into what it really means. We'll spend 5 long minutes on what Daniel chapter 7 really means to us at this end of the age, especially in the light of what we like to call present truth. So to kind of pick up on what Brother Isaiah was talking about with regard to Daniel. Daniel, we know, was an incredibly interesting and potent character in the Bible. And one thing I find interesting is that he had a contemporary in Babylon that went in the same captivity. We have to remember that Daniel actually went about a decade. I'm going to speak in rough terms. We're not going to be precise about this because, to be honest with you, there's even debates among scholars on the precision of the dating and all of the various kings and things that happened. We're going to stick strictly with the scriptural account of these things. There's a lot of other details that the scriptures intentionally leave out, meaning it's probably not really that important for us to go into. You can get lost in extra-biblical chronology, extra-biblical accounting of kings, things like that, but what makes Daniel really interesting is he went in the Jehoiakim captivity. And he was very young, as we know, somewhere in his teen years, more than likely. By the time we get to Daniel chapter 7, and if you read the book of Daniel from the first chapter to chapter 12, you realize it's not in sequence. It's very much out of sequence. You know, a chapter we deal with Nebuchadnezzar, and then we jump to Belshazzar, then we jump to Darius, and we jump back to Belshazzar, and then we jump to Darius again, and then we jump to Cyrus. So you always have to be careful of how you read the book of Daniel. The other thing I like to do as well is I like to break things. I was born with this proclivity to destroy. And every toy I ever got as a kid, I didn't play with it. I broke it. I just wanted to see how it worked. I like to see what made it tick, everything. And I like to do that with our understanding of certain scriptures because I'm a firm believer. If we have what we call the truth on something, we have nothing to fear. Let it be questioned. Let it be analyzed. Let it be critiqued. It'll stand. Truth will always stand. Always. So I think it's important to always question the status quo. To always try to break it. Because if it is truth, it won't break. It'll stand. There's nothing to be afraid of questioning what we call present truth. It's all right. Doubting is a different thing. But questioning and trying to be bereaved about the way we understand things. So, not to belabor this point, Daniel, again, was a contemporary of Ezekiel. I always wondered, there's no account in the Bible whether Daniel and Ezekiel ever talked, whether they ever met. But Ezekiel mentions Daniel. He does it twice. How does he mention Daniel? Anybody? Yeah, he says, Ezekiel says, though, he says it twice in chapter 14, I believe, of Ezekiel. He says, though Noah, Daniel, and Job, they'd only saved their own skin in this day of judgment that he's talking about. And every single time Gabriel comes to Daniel, what does he introduce himself with to Daniel? How does he introduce himself to Daniel? Anybody? Greatly beloved of God. Think about that for a second. Imagine right now an angel appeared before you and said your name and said you are greatly beloved of God. Think about that. I mean, it sends chills down my spine. It gives me goose pimples to think an angel just appeared before me and said, I'm greatly beloved by God. That would blow my mind. That would just, I can't even imagine that. That's got to be the most incredible sensation anyone can have in this flesh. So Daniel, being the interesting character that he is, had, of course, a very long life, as we understand it. There's debate on certain dates and longevity and everything, but Daniel, more than likely, was a centenarian, lived beyond 100 years. Again, we won't get into those details, but as was brought out by Brother Isaiah, he took many stands on many things, and through his life, literally, on the Lord's care at every turn, whether he was in the lion's den, whether it was when he was very young with the three Hebrews. He was just such a remarkable man, and he lived through so many regencies, from Nebuchadnezzar on down to Belshazzar, and then and Babylon, we know, wasn't destroyed, by the way. We have to keep that in mind. Babylon was not destroyed. Babylon, it was a coup right at the very top. When Belshazzar and his court were destroyed, but Darius and then subsequently Cyrus, they took over the kingdom, and it was very much intact. Basically, the Babylonians woke up one morning and they're like, oh, we've got new leaders. Okay, we'll roll with it. And Daniel, as far as we know, there's no record of Daniel ever returning to Israel. The Lord saw fit that he could do much more for his natural people by remaining in Babylon during these times. And it's amazing, he must have been such an outstanding character for foreign kings like Nebuchadnezzar, like those that succeeded Nebuchadnezzar. Even Belshazzar, who basically had Daniel put on a shelf somewhere to collect dust until he was needed. And then subsequently Darius greatly beloved Daniel. Darius had great affection for Daniel, we find out in the book of his namesake. So, getting to Daniel chapter 7, sorry, my phone turned itself off here. In the first year, we're doing the first 3 verses, by the way, which I think are the easiest part of this particular assignment. First year, Belshazzar. First year. Belshazzar in the previous chapter was already dead, and someone else took over. But we're in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. I'm reading from the King James Bible. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. He didn't tell it to another person. Sorry. He told it by writing it down, what we're reading right now, and he summarized. He didn't go into, we have a lot of detail, but there's a lot of detail that was left out as well. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea. This is important, by the way. This is not the 4 winds in Revelation chapter 7 that were held back by the angel. This is a completely different topic. You would have a great deal of problem. If it is those 4 winds, then these 4 beasts that come up are not who we think they are. So I think that the current understanding is in the correct ballpark as I see it. I don't see a better explanation than we currently have of these 4 beasts. Verse 3, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another, which is an important point, diverse one from another. They're not patterned after each other. It's not like succeeding. So a pattern would be if a king has a son and that son takes over a kingdom, etc. These are completely displacing, one kingdom coming up after another, displacing the one that was before it. But some vestige of those kingdoms still remain, as we find out in the image vision that came much earlier. And I really apologize for going so fast because we have about 3 or 4 minutes to kind of wrap up these details before we open it up. I imagine questions are going to be variegated and very non-specific necessarily, but I think certain keys are, 1, this is not the Daniel chapter 7, 4 winds that are held back by the angel, because that's a much more inclusive vision. That has to do with the sealing of the saints at the very end of the gospel age, prior to the release of 4 winds, which hurt not just the sea, but also the trees and the grass and a number of other things. So that, I think, is a key to opening up the understanding. But again, we have to be open to other avenues of thought on interpreting these.
Given Daniel's vision of the four winds of heaven, stirring of the great sea, from which the four beasts emerged, what is the symbolic relationship between the four winds, the great sea, and the four beasts?
Okay, I'm just going to go with the canned explanation because I don't have a better one. And of course, that is the great sea. We like to call the restless masses or the unorganized, whatever you want to call it, of humanity. The four winds typically represents, I would say, opinion, like a global or a very large magnitude shakeup of the order of things that comes from, that it affects the sea but doesn't come from the sea. But the interesting thing is that the four beasts themselves actually come out of the sea. So they come out of this restless masses. But the conditions for the emergence of these four beasts are predicated on this whirlwind or these four winds having a direct effect on the sea itself. So without that conflagration, without that let's call it near anarchy or the emergent, then these beasts don't come up. And they come up, we see, in succession. They come up one at a time, one after the other, rather than all four at the same time, of course, which leads us to believe that they're successive world powers. And since it seems to match up, and I do have an open question about this myself, by the way, why does God seem to represent the same thing in different ways in Daniel? You've got the head, you've got the image, you've got other animals and beasts and other Daniel visions, and then you have this accounting of beasts in, so the standard explanation, I think, is that it's the same thing from different perspectives and has different effects for different people depending upon, different whatevers. That's really kind of a cheesy escapist answer, but... And you have a follow-up? And we'll be very quick, and then we'll end it back.
Yes, for your question, you said, why the same visions on different view? Daniel 2nd chapter is man's view of the younger kingdoms. It's a grandeur with glory. But Daniel 7th chapter, it's a God's view. God's view is they're going to eat them like beasts. So
yes. So.
Yeah, I don't. The person supposed to go to the Isaiah. I think those should get us in. If you look at chapter 5, Christ that the king made a provision to feed Daniel and his men. And he said that Daniel, they did not say, they the king, no, we are not going to eat the fried meal. And the meal had been released every day. And those men appointed to take care of them, eat the meal, and give Daniel wisdom. So in our case, let's say, let me use my country. If you are working with a government and they are Muslims, this month they were fasting. The normally try to unite Muslim and Christian. And there are certain things they give out. Probably it didn't support them and they want to partake. And that is such one we have approved and been approved. Is it necessary for us, instead of telling them to do what they want, to allow those who bring it to you to take it? There are those who release it, in their heart, they talk that yes, they have accepted. So we allow those who brought other money or food to take it away, as if you are the one, or you sign and allow them to go with you. Is it right? Because Daniel did not tell those men, no, I don't want to take it back. The king still released the food, and those men eat the food. And the king thought that yes, actually Daniel they were eating the food more than what. Now, okay, what do you do? Do you sign the money that maybe the president of government release for families who are fasting and those who are fasting. And some I think you are taking why you rejected it. But it's not about doing that they don't want. But they thought that they are not to go ahead. But they are trying to grant nature of peace to them. Trying to get peace. Is it necessary for you to sign and allow the person who got that message to go with you? You can't keep going, you can't go home.
Okay, so I apologize. I didn't really understand the question, so can somebody paraphrase to me? Brother Austin? I'm actually having a difficult time understanding the accent. That's my 10 years.
Call me, my answer is no.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Brother Moses, if you could. Put the mic up to you.
What is asking is that in some countries, government give some funds to people who are fasting, Muslims that are fasting. Okay, so if you are in a place where such funds are given, and you are expected to sign and collect, the legal right is you refuse to sign and collect, while others are signing and collecting. I don't know if that's what you are, you mean, that's what I'm saying.
So
That's what I understand from you.
let me paraphrase what I think he's saying, if he's right on what you're saying, that let's say you're in an environment, a country, whatever, area, region, where there are it's dominated by certain norms, whether religious or social or whatever. Is it okay for you to conform to those norms, or should we always stand back and abstain? And I don't think there's a definite, answer given. I'll point out two things. One is obviously your conscience. What you feel is right or wrong, you should always abide by that. You may turn out to be wrong later on, but if it's your conscience, here's the interesting thing with how a conscience works. Your conscience can be wrongly instructed, but you can violate your conscience and do the right thing, but go against your conscience, and believe it or not, that's actually wrong, unless the wrong thing that you're doing is truly harmful to another person. The other thing I will bring out is the Apostle Paul had Timothy circumcised. Timothy didn't need to be circumcised for the gospel's sake, but it made interacting with Jews possible, and it was for the gospel's sake. It was to not bear any reproach or to not provide any impediment to preaching the gospel. Paul did the same thing. He went to Jerusalem to shave his head and put on sackcloth and ashes and do this fasting thing, not because it was something that the gospel required him to do, but because he felt that would be expedient and would keep him in good standing with his Jewish brethren, so he could preach Christ and the gospel rather than close the doors. So the ultimate thing would be, is it a direct violation of Scripture? That's very clear. Is it a violation of your conscience? In which case, we must take a stand. We must, regardless of what the circumstances would be. Or is it something that can be flexible? And I'll bring up one more thing. It looks like we have about 2.5 minutes. In the early church, when they faced Roman persecution, intense Roman persecution, the compromise was very easy. A lot of Roman magistrates made it very easy, or Roman centurions, whatever you want to call them. A lot of times all a Christian would have to do is, all they'd say is, hey, listen, we get that you have a different God. We get that you don't believe our emperor is God. But to keep the peace, just take this incense and throw it on the fire. That's all we're asking. Just take this incense and throw it on the fire. Now, a lot of us would say, well, I don't believe the emperor is God. It's not a violation of my conscience. I can take that incense and throw it on the fire. But many brethren would not even make that slight compromise because for their conscience sake, they felt that that was somehow disobeying or being unfaithful to the Lord. So that's, again, that comes down to, and we look back and we think of them as heroes of faith, since we're on that subject. So, sorry for the long-winded, we have time for one more question.
Thank you.
Oh, Sister Kathy.
Thank you, Brother Brendan. I think you said something that I hadn't thought of before, so please let me know whether or not this is what you said. When the city of Babylon was taken over by the Medo-Persians, did you say that the people who remained were still Babylonians, or were they now Medo-Persians because the Babylonian Empire was crushed?
Okay. So, the Babylonian Empire was not crushed. Only the Babylonian body politic was changed. So they were still Babylonians, but they became a vassal state. And depending on who you talk to, they were already a vassal state of the Medes and the Persians. Again, that's extra biblical discussion. So, so they were still Babylonians, and as a matter of fact, it talks about Darius and Cyrus being appointed over Babylon as the prefecture, or whatever you want to call it. So Babylon experienced very little in the way of shift down, like the boots on the ground. The actual civilians, the actual people of Babylon, they just were now under, it was under new management.